One of the most fun things about doing this series is the fact that I am finding all of these wonderful women doing their wonderful work right here in my own community. And that to me is in and of itself more wonderful perhaps than anything else. I mean, not like it's a problem to search for these women far and wide, out there in the world and pull them into my studio, my virtual studio, so to speak. But, when you find them right here under your own nose, right here close at hand, I mean, wow, that's an opportunity to showcase them if nothing else is. So I recently had the opportunity to speak with Gayatri Yadav, who is a very old and dear friend, first and foremost. And more importantly, today she is the Chief Marketing Officer of Sequoia Ventures India. Gabby, as we affectionately call her, has spent years and years and years doing some remarkable work. She started off in a Punjabi family business, her own family, in some way similar to my background, although I'm going to argue that the Vasudevas were perhaps less traditional. We'll see why once I start talking to her. And she has, in her early years, worked for Procter and Gamble on FMCG, the FMCG sector, and from there she went to media. From media now to finance and investment. So really, she has covered the full gamut of, well, many things, I should say. So, without further ado, I'm going to launch into my interview with Gabby. I have to say, when we started out, she had the most remarkable background. I mean, I love my background with my books and my printer that I don't actually use because the one I do use is there. But she has this remarkable background, so I had to ask her about that before I asked her about anything else.
Yeah, this background is special. When Don Valentine started the firm in the early 70s, he didn't name it after himself. He could have called it Valentine and Partners, but he decided that he was going to build a firm that would outlive him and a firm that stood for the values of Sequoia. And it's interesting, right? And we'll talk about it that I've worked in a couple of companies before Sequoia, and every company teaches you something. In Star, I learned the power of scale. In Sequoia, I'm learning the power of just taking a really long term view. So, the mission of Sequoia is to partner with daring founders and help build legendary, read that as enduring companies. And that's a really hard thing, right? Because only 2% of companies who raise seed capital go on to raise Series D. So, most companies die. That's just the nature of growth. And it's a few that survive and endure. And that's really the holy grail. So the sequoia is the oldest redwood and grows, as it sort of lives as long as 3,000 years and can grow over 200 feet high. And so that's a fitting symbol for trying to build, businesses that can transcend time and that can endure. So if sequoia trees it is as my background to inspire us to have, to take the long view.
And what an inspiration. It sort of reminds me of when we were kids and, the stories we would read about the magic faraway tree and, climbing to its very top gives you the ability to sort of, as you say, that have that long-term view, that view of sort of everything around you. Your current role at Sequoia Capital actually puts you in a variety of leadership roles, right? Not only are you responsible for the brand strategy of the company itself, but you also mentor its startups and its portfolio companies. So, how on an average day do you chart your course, given all of these multiple things to do?
Yeah, firstly, I say this is not a job, it's a privilege. It's an insane privilege to have almost a ringside view on the crucible of change in the Indian and Southeast Asian startup ecosystem. So it's fascinating. And in a given day, I'm context switching on steroids, right? So I start my day maybe advising an edtech company, you know, during lunch, I may be talking to fintech. In the afternoon, it's health tech. And I end my day direct to consumer. So, I mean, that sort of a spectrum of, portfolio of companies is fascinating. And I sort of wear two hats. One is about, as a brand steward for this amazing brand, Sequoia, and, marketing the firm and the firm's programs. And we have a series of programs right from seedlings, which is early stage called Surge, which is, a combination of capital and curriculum for, companies which are just starting off the gate. And then we have a late stage program called the Guild, which is, it has a very select group of founders, and these are largely unicorns with a collective value of about 16 founders at over 35 billion. And these are companies where, you would probably say that they've already achieved success and they should just sit back and enjoy it. But no, these are companies that have achieved success, but are going for, trying to build a legendary company that can transcend time. And they recognize that the only thing that they need to right now focus on to scale their company is to scale themselves. So Guild is really a learning and development program, for founders at a late stage. So we have a series of programs to help partner with the founders we work with. So that's one part of my job is marketing the brand Sequoia. But the other part is, as you said, just working across this portfolio of companies and helping scale brands and businesses. And it's a fascinating challenge because, India is now the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. So that is incredible, right? We have about 37 unicorns, which is third only to the US and China. And we have all these businesses that are growing, and it's the new era of corporate. It's new energies, it's innovation across across a portfolio of companies. But it's interesting that we still don't have any brands in the top 100 lists in the world. So if you look at Interbrand top 100 list, or if you look at all of these, you'll see a lot of brands from America, some from UK, some from Europe, but none from India. So
Mm.
that's sort of one of the things that I'd love to work on is how do we build legendary businesses and brands out of the region, both India and Southeast Asia, and sort of put the flag on the world's map. So that's a fascinating opportunity, and it's just so energizing, really, to meet these young founders, with these large dreams and a real belief. And I wouldn't say that there's false positivity. There's real optimism. There's a real belief in the thesis of technology as a world shaper, and the belief that, with their companies, that they can really make that dent in the universe. So that's sort of the unifier that I see, whether it's a 60-year-old founder or a 25-year-old founder. Or the other day, I got a LinkedIn message from a 16-year-old saying he's working on some game-changing idea on EVs. And I was like, wow, this is a really exciting time to be in the startup ecosystem in this
It
region.
is. It is. It sounds fascinating. And you've got a very large and diverse task list. I have so many questions, Gabby. So, firstly, you mentioned your seedling companies, and you said these are your youngest companies and you offer them curriculum. I'm very interested in asking about this because right before that, you said there's very, very few, I forget the number, but you mentioned there's very few companies that actually make it to the Series D stage. Is
Yes.
this why you need to offer them curriculum so that they have a better shot of getting there?
Yeah, it's building a business it's not a science. It's a science, it's an art. There's luck, there's so many factors, right? But the fundamental piece is the founder and the founder's conviction and the founder's belief. But when you start a business, it's kind of lonely. It's you, your co-founder, there may be two or three people, you have this great idea, you have a thesis, you're galvanizing a team, you're fundraising, and it can be quite difficult to navigate some of those choices. We call them crucible moments, so crucible decisions that can be really make or break at the early stage. And at that stage, it's sort of awesome, right, to have someone just to tell you how it's done or to share with you examples of how other companies have done it. So we have mentor founders, who have also been part of Surge, maybe 3 years down, or these founders who are now unicorns. And as a way of giving back to the ecosystem, they come and share their journeys. And there's nothing like learning from someone who's been there and done that, right? So it's this amazing community of founders learning from other founders, learning from practitioners, learning from partners in the system who have seen over 50 years of company building, and sharing almost their tribal knowledge and know-how to help these young companies, or the seed companies as we call them, these seedlings grow. And learning is something, when we were in school, and Rini and I went, you and I went to school together. You sort of thought when you finished school and college that you were done with learning, right? But we now realize that learning is lifelong, and it is a one thing to keep you relevant and keep you ahead of what is a world that's changing every day, every second. And so it's super important for the founders not just to have capital, but to be part of community and to get exposure to tribal know-how, advice, and curriculum to help them navigate these really interesting decisions. And that is true for whatever stage you're in, whether you're at seed, or whether you're scaling your company, or whether you've got to scale and now it's about going public, or whether even after you've gone public, right? Yeah, it can be a lonely job to be a CEO, to run a company, to have a community of people that you can go back to, that can act as a sounding board.
So let's talk about what it is that makes a company legendary, as you say, right? When you talk about your companies in the guild, and by the way, I love that nomenclature as a writer, the guild just really hits the spot for me. um, so you say that these are companies which have scaled, which are doing well, but they're really looking to further expand such that they become known as legendary companies. And you also said that there are actually very few of these legendary companies in India, legendary on the international level. Now, when I think about the corporate history of India, I think about legendary names and companies, the Tatas, the Birlas, a lot of family companies that set up perhaps the infrastructure of our country, so to speak, in various ways, shapes and forms. And I know you come from such a background yourself. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But so why is it then that India doesn't have these companies known on an international scale? What's missing all these years?
That's an interesting question. Okay, what makes a company legendary? I think the first threshold is something that can endure, right? So if you look at maybe the 1980s as well, right? The average lifespan of a company was about 60 years old. And if you look at the 2010s, the average lifespan of a company is down to less than 20 years old. So the rate of technological progress and the rate of change is so extreme that it is compressing the lifespan of companies. So at the first level, it is just that, can you build a company that can transcend time, that can stay relevant, that can keep reinventing, that can stay true to its purpose, and that can redefine itself each year, each decade, and endure, and not just endure, but thrive, right? And that itself is a really, really hard task. When I talked about India, I think India is interesting because we've had a very long history of a free entrepreneurial market, right? So we do have a lot of small businesses. We have over 60 million small businesses. We have over 10 million micro MSMEs. We have over 60 million retail merchants. And we have, as you said, the large industrial family businesses, etc. When I was talking about the lack of legendary, I was talking about legendary brands or companies on a global scale. And for a company to get to a legendary brand at a global scale, you need to get at least 30 or 40% of your revenue from outside home market. You need to have moved out of India, captured global markets, and built a name and built that global awareness. I think we've been at a stage where it's been creating Indian brands and companies in India for India. India itself has been so vast that I always remember, right, that when I used to travel to Delhi as a child, there used to be my favorite ice cream chain or restaurant chain called Nirula's. And I used to always wonder, why is it Nirula's in Bombay? Why does it have to be like another country that you have to go to Delhi to enjoy Nirula? So I think the first phase was just about India was so diverse and the local markets itself were so deep that just servicing the local market could provide the scale,
Mm.
and maybe meet the aspiration and ambition of the local entrepreneur. So that was phase one. Phase two, it's got to national, creating these diverse portfolios that meet the complexity, which is quite subcontinental in nature in India. And now we're seeing a lot of companies in India which are building for India and building for the world. So in our latest cohort in Surge, which was the early stage program I talked about, we had more than half the cohort, which was building for the world from get go. So they're not waiting to say, I'm going to hit X level sales and then I'm going to go and service the world. They're building in India for the world, right? And it's not to say building in India is better than building in for the world. There's no right or wrong. In in this, it's a choice. But it's interesting to now see just the panoply of choices and the spectrum of companies, that no longer is it just that you need to be part of a family business or part of an industrial house to build a company of scale, or you need to be one of the FMCG companies that have been here for like close to 100 years. You have now direct to consumer brands because of the power of the internet. We used to earlier say distribution is a moat, right? It's how you can build competitive advantage. And it is true, distribution is a moat. But today it's easier to build that moat. You
Yeah.
don't need to set up a national sales force. You can sell your product on Amazon and be global. So there's this company in the portfolio called Mama Earth, it's a very interesting story of this young couple who had a baby, Varun and Ghazal Alag, and they just couldn't find baby products that they could trust for their baby. So they decided to create the products, right? And then they decided to sell the products, and they have already they're already the size of pretty large FMCG company in a period of a couple of years. And that's actually today, with the power of the internet, if you have an idea, you can pretty much with a fairly low investment get a business started, get your products to the world, get product market fit, as we call it, and then scale. And then you can scale for India, scale for the world. And there's so many stories. There's a toy manufacturer in India that's one of the top listed toys in Amazon in the US, which helps kids think. I mean, the creativity in these business models is mind-boggling.
I love this analogy of distribution being a moat. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit and specifically ask you, okay, you started off saying, in the morning you're talking to fintech companies. By the end of the day, you're talking to consumer goods and so on and so forth. Today you're a VC. You started out with Procter and Gamble in the FMCG sector. And I would argue before that, in your own home, your own family business, also in the FMCG sector, right? When I think about a moat, I also think about the people within that town or province or castle or whatever that are trapped in by the moat and cannot get out because there are alligators or whatever. There are good reasons for the moat, right? But I'd like to ask you specifically about your journey and how easy or hard it has been to traverse sectors, with your own background and in the family and sort of the moats along the way.
I grew up in a family where, brands were discussed on the dining table, where we had Sunday meetings where there were leather bound minutes books and chairmanship would rotate. So it was quite a corporate affair, family meetings were. And that was daily diet. So I guess it was part of the air I was breathing. And for a while, I actually thought that I would rebel against that and, go to Cambridge and become a lawyer. And then I got into Cambridge. And when it came to that choice between IIM and Cambridge and law and management, I realized that what I really wanted to do was business and management, because I felt that that was really a path or a vehicle to drive dramatic change at scale. And I joined IIM Calcutta, which was a fascinating experience because I'd grown, been born and brought up in Bombay. I had majored in English literature. And then I went to IIM Calcutta, which was 98% IIT. And they just assumed that you knew calculus, like you knew English. And I obviously didn't, because I had studied English literature, and then I ended up at this highly technical, highly sort of quantitative campus, which was fascinating, right? Just to be plucked out of a bubble, and it's almost like joining college in Spanish, and when one didn't know Spanish, right? So it was a completely new language, and to learn, and sort of be thrown out of your comfort zone. And I realized that I actually grow when I'm thrown out of my comfort zone, right? That's when I really feel alive, and I feel like I'm growing, and I feel very uncomfortable, but also strangely happy and excited and alive. So that was IIM Calcutta. And then I joined Procter and Gamble, which was like doing an MBA again. It was fantastic learning. And I always advocate that your first job should be with a company that really knows its trade and can train you, because that's super important to get the right mentor, especially at the beginning. I spent about 5 years there. I was part of a very rookie part of the launch team that launched Whisper. And I almost saw, that marketing could almost work if you get the principles right, it works. So, P&G did everything in the Whisper category, right from a compelling insight. The women were looking not just for protection, but superior protection that allowed them in their period days to go and live a life. Very, it was actually product superiority. And when P&G says product superiority, it meant that in a blind product test versus competition, when the brands are mass, 60% of people should prefer our product. That's product superiority. Very, very hard to get. So you need a compelling insight, product superiority, a disruptive marketing mix. I remember when competition was showing women in white jeans playing volleyball, Whisper showed a woman coming on screen and saying, I need to share something with you because I found something amazing. We actually showed the product. So it really disrupted the rules, and pretty much got to leadership within 2 years of launch. And that taught me a lot. So Procter, I really learned the fundamentals of marketing. I also went and I was a salesperson in upcountry Maharashtra, looking after Kolhapur and Ratnagiri districts. And that was, life-changing, to be a young woman salesperson when they didn't even imagine that any woman could be in sales, and there were no toilets for women, so you certainly learned bladder control. There was, it was fascinating to work the markets till really late on a van and visit rural markets. But I remember really thinking, even back then, and I'm talking close to 25, 28 years ago, thinking that the retailer was really mature and sophisticated, and I would go and transact business, and they would not even look askance at who is this woman wearing a dress, jumping out of a van. And I recall when I had to work the markets, we used to have those three-wheelers, right? Where, what's known as a ready stock unit or an RSU. And it's literally a little rickshaw. It's like a little three-wheeler where the stock is at the back and there's one seat in the front for the driver. And typically the salesperson would share that little seat with the driver, right? And so it was really funny because I had got there in Kolhapur, and the stockist looked at me and the little driver looked at me. I was meant to be the salesperson going on the beat, and said, how will you, this is impossible. And then the stockist said that I'll hire a taxi for you. And I said, whatever margin you earn, you're going to lose, right? With me and being this taxi and going for the sales beat. And we had to do 40 outlets a day, and go and sell. So I said, I'll sit on the stock. So I went and sat at the back on the stock. And because I wanted to breathe and not have the door shut on me, I would literally hold the door ajar with a rope. and with my leg. So sort of been there, done that, in the early days, which was really, really taught me a lot. And then from P&G, I went to General Mills. I was the second employee and I launched Pillsbury in India and scaled that business, which really was my entrepreneurial experience, going through the highs and lows. Stayed there for 14 years, at the end of which I felt that this was really almost like my life's work. And I knew I needed to leave, but I couldn't leave from there to something. I needed to take a break. And everyone told me, don't just leave without a job and you can't do that. You know, and this was, I'm talking about 2010. So about a decade back, when it wasn't still so fashionable just to quit and go without a reason. And I said, no, there's no way I can do this. I really need to reinvent myself. So I took 9 months off, and that's become now my formula, which is, it takes 9 months to create a baby in terms of the gestation period. And I think it takes 9 months to reinvent yourself. And I took 9 months off, traveled the world, tried to really figure out what I wanted to do. And I decided that I had done something very entrepreneurial and it was very creational, but I hadn't really got to scale as yet. The company was, still small, about a couple of maybe little less than $100 million. And I felt I really wanted to test myself on scale. So that's when I was called by Uday Shankar, and he said, I was considering at that point joining a soft drink company. And he said, how can you sell sugar water when you could inspire a billion imaginations? And that's when I joined Star. And, I was mentioning that Sequoia's taught me the long view. Star taught me scale. When you're marketing to 900, 800, 900 million people, you really understand what scale's about and you understand what it takes to inspire a billion imaginations. And I worked on entertainment. I launched Satyamev Jayate, that really was perhaps the most moving project of my life. Worked on sports, worked on kabaddi, football, launched Hotstar, which was really exciting, and then was the president of consumer strategy and innovation, did 9 years at Star, and again felt I needed to reinvent myself, which is when October 19, I quit and took another 9 months off, which sort of coincided with the pandemic as well. And the first thing I did was I went to the US and said I have to become a student again, which is when I went to Harvard and did a course with Porter, and then traveled in the US from Boston to New York, and then I met you at the Bay Area, and really used that time to again reflect and reinvent. March was when the pandemic started, in terms of the lockdown started in India. And I went into reflection mode about what is it I want to do. And when I thought about my why and my purpose, I decided that I was really excited by impact at scale. So, how do I create transformational impact at scale? Was really my why. How I'd like to do it is leveraging my skills in business strategy and communication. And I felt that I wanted to work on a diverse set of challenges and not fixate on one problem. And that's when when I sort of thought about it, I said, well, that means it has to be a portfolio of opportunities. It has to be venture capital. And lo and behold, the next day I got a call from Sequoia. So I think it's sort of the clarity manifested the serendipity. And I do think it's important, I mean, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, someone who said that life isn't about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. So you are work in progress. You have to focus on yourself. I keep telling folks in my team as well, or people I work with, that we provide all this analytical rigor and frameworks and to our brands and our businesses. Why don't we apply the same to ourselves? So really, focusing on yourself, taking the time out. And I'm not advocating for everyone that you need to quit your job, right? I felt I felt I wanted to take that risk, whether it was middle of, but I took my first, sabbatical 18 years after working. So it's not that I just did it 5 years in, right? But I found that both the sabbaticals were super important for me. and helped me reflect and reinvent and take the next leap.
Very interesting. From fast moving consumer goods to media to venture capital. By the way, that story about you sitting on the stalk at the at the back of the three-wheeler and holding the door ajar, I mean, I think that speaks volumes, right? That really is learning how to swim that moat, or however you want to look at it. So, which leads me to ask you about traditional roles and women in traditional roles. Actually, I should rephrase that. It's not so much women in traditional roles as women sort of breaking, that barrier, right? I work with a lot of women um, here when it comes to mentoring them, women on boards, women startups, women owned companies, women sort of in the finance and investing world. When I look at India, which is, of course, my pet peeve, I love it. I'm from there, like you. Um, I see a lot of women in leadership roles in government, small businesses, even bigger businesses. So, and then I see you, woman in a leadership role, and sort of one of my favorite women. So that's like extra special. But I'd like to ask, is it difficult for women in India? I mean, we know that it's not easy for women anywhere, but is it more difficult for women in India to be in these leadership roles?
That's a hard question, right? Because I can speak at two levels from my experience and then abstracting outside myself and looking at the landscape. So if I talk from my experience, I think it was no more difficult or less difficult than any man. And I think partially that was because maybe the way I was brought up, that I was just brought up to think that, that I wasn't any different, that I was, the same as my brothers, and that there's no reason why I should expect anything differently or, have not lower, but have different goals. But we all were given the freedom to be who we wanted to be. And I sort of maybe just, tapped into that and at times wore blinkers and just went on, right? So, and that was pretty much how I defined myself. And if anyone would ever call me a woman leader as opposed to a leader, I would go like, but I'm a leader, I'm a CMO, I'm a manager. Why are you calling me like, I don't get it. Why are you saying, you know,
Why you
and then
define
I realized,
them?
why are you defining me by my gender when I don't? I mean, of course, being a woman is really important to me, but I'd never defined my job in gendered terms. But I remember somewhere 10 years into working, I was in a panel, in a leadership panel, and it was being discussed why women need to work maybe not as hard, but even harder than men. And that's when it sort of, I sort of stepped in and I said, why do we want women to work harder than men? And then the conversation went on to how women need to be more like men. And it reminded me of that Henry Higgins song in My Fair Lady, why can't a woman be more like a man? And I said, women have joined the workforce, and versus embracing diversity and maybe becoming a more flexible workforce and maybe just recognizing that maybe things need to change a bit, to embrace this infusion, we are trying to stick to conformity. And I still remember in that panel, one of my mentors looked across the room and she said, Gayatri, you work harder than any man I know. And I said, it's not about myself. And I think that's a shift that happened, really, that I realized that there is an experience I have had, and there is an obligation I have as a leader to make sure that this becomes a space where more and more women can flourish and be successful. And we need to examine what is it we need to do for that to happen, whether that is, you know, you need to fight sexism, whether that is you need to create inspirational storytelling that changes the stereotype. For instance, in India, there's still a large cultural narrative, and not so much in the upper SECs, socioeconomic classes, but more maybe middle to lower as well, or maybe even in the upper as well, that a woman working outside is a sign of hard times on the family. That means the husband or the male earning can't support the family. So these are tropes or narratives or stereotypes that need to be changed, right? Now it doesn't matter if that stereotype didn't exist in my family, quite the opposite. But what matters is what you have to almost wear two hats. One is your own experience, but the other is what's happening in the world and what can you do as a leader to change that. And I always say that, we're in this position of privilege and we have a platform of change. If we don't do anything about it, history will not forgive us. History won't forgive me, won't forgive you. If we just sit back and say, oh, we've had these interesting lives and I haven't faced, blah, blah, blah. And, therefore, I'm going to assume the world is apple pie. It's not. It's very hard for a lot of women, and they have to fight multiple battles, to whether it's to work, whether it is to continue working. In a lot of cultures, a child is when a woman starts considering whether she should take a break or no. In India, marriage becomes a situation where it's just like bizarre that that's happening. So we actually, I mean, hats off to the government and to the nation as a whole that we have more girl graduates than boys. So we've demonstrated capacity to make massive change. And it's still not trickled down. So education's gain has still not trickled down to employment. So if I look at, but I do believe that India is capable of massive positive societal change, as we've seen it happen. We've had years of Beti Padhao, or whatever, progress in nation, through the education of the girl child. So the way I mean, I would skin it at three levels at the corporate level. One is we have an enrollment challenge. So India, our numbers, overall working women in India used to be 30%, it's down to 20%. The second is we have a retention challenge. That means even if women join the workforce, they drop off for various reasons. Could be marriage, could be child, etc. Could just be facing a lot of pressure either at home or office and they just give up and drop off. And then third is we have an advancement challenge, which is a leadership challenge. And I do think that we need to address enrollment, retention, and leadership and have different strategies for each. And there's a larger narrative of making working aspirational, actually positioning, and we should do Bollywood films of the working women. Make it the cultural trope that this is what I want my daughter to be, without knocking anyone's choices, right? If someone decides that they don't want to work of their free will, they want to be at home, that is a woman's right to exercise her choice. I mean, I would argue that it's good to be financially independent, to really have full freedom, but that's every person's choice. But overall, I think there is a lot of work to do because the roots of the issue are cultural. There is work to do to remedy it. Um, and as well as I think there are strategies we need to look at for enrollment, retention, advancement. I was seeing a study the other day that showed that just adding the word flexible to a job description in the UK increased the number of women who applied by 6x. So, the reality is a lot of women are actually doing two jobs.
Yeah.
And how do you recognize that fact? A, make sure that parenting and home care is more of a shared task, as well as recognizing that while that changes, the answer is not just to tell the woman, you got to work as hard as a man for 12 hours, but figure solutions that allow her to do both while still holding performance goal. So I think it will need us to look at very different solutions. But I do believe that we've done it in education, and I believe that India will do this, and in our lifetime.
I like the way you skin it into these three categories. It really makes it puts focus on what needs to be done at these different levels of progression. So we are coming up to time. So I do have just a couple more questions, but I have to ask you real quick. When you talked about yourself and the fact that you were raised in a situation where you did the same things as your brothers and there was no difference. And so you then questioned later on, what is this woman leader? Why not just leader? I think that is just beautiful, 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 because that is an example to so many women. We just have to think of ourselves as the leaders and not define that by gender, what that means, right? I'd love to ask you real quick, who would you give credit to for having been raised like that?
My father and my grandfather. And, I mean, if I had to pick one, I would say my father. He was just, as you know, an exceptional man. Um, and as I look back, I'm still going, still revisiting the learnings. Just he led by example, just the sort of person he was. The courage and the unflinching integrity to live life on his terms. And I remember my father used to, I think I was reading about Jeff Bezos and how he lives his life using the regret minimization framework, that when he gets to 80, he wants to look back and say that he doesn't regret anything. If I think of my father and grandfather, they sort of, and I'm putting words in both their mouths, and I'm sure they'll be looking at me from above saying, why are you paraphrasing what we said? But they sort of lived their life with a very simple principle that they could sleep well at night, that their conscience was clear, that they did what they had to. It was never about this race about who gets wealthiest and what's, the size. Wasn't the Godzilla principle. It was, let's just build a business, let's build it honestly, let's, build a brand, let's do the right thing for the family, do the right thing for the community. It's what Simon Sinek calls the infinite game. It wasn't finite. It wasn't about X crores or Y market share or Z market capitalization. It was about, like a lot of our founders as well, really looking at the long term and just recognizing that, there's a very long horizon, and you just got to do the right thing every day. And peace of mind and good sleep
Good sleep.
is important. Yeah.
Important.
That's just so that I would credit a lot to my father and grandfather.
And I never had the pleasure of
And
meeting your grandfather, but your father, I have deep respect for. Remember some very impactful conversations I've had with him. So I can certainly identify with that sort of heritage of knowledge and outstanding upbringing. Last question, Gabby, is, and I hate to say that it's the last question. I want to go on for another hour. What is your call to action for women? I mean, you have laid out this roadmap for what we need to do to encourage them and promote them and put them out there in society and in the corporate world. What is your call to action for them?
I think there's a lot of pressure on women, because there are all these labels, right? Feminism, sexism. There's all these role models and this advice and this, and what I would say is just find your own ism, right? And be absolutely free to, you have, this is this is your life, and it is your life, and find your ism, whatever it is that's going to make you happy. No one can tell you you need to work 9 to 5, you need to work 5 to 9, you need to be, you know, as long as you have the freedom to be who you want to be, whatever that is, just believe it, dream it, do it, and it's your life. Maximize it and find your own ism, live your own ism. Don't let anyone define you, slot you, force you to be something you're not, and believe that you can. I think it's a bit of Charles Dickens. It's a bit of the best of times and the worst of times, but I would say it's more the best of times, because things are changing and they will change so fast. And I don't believe this is a generational game. I believe it'll happen. It'll happen in this generation.
Find your own ism. I love it. What a wonderful way to start my Monday and my week. I'm going to head out with a little bit of Gabbyism, Gayatrism, however we want to define it. It's making me smile. It makes me happy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thankfully, you didn't say Gayatri Mantra. So, yeah.
Well, that'll be my mantra. Gayatri Mantra. It's amazing the amount that you can actually learn from your own peers, right? When you grow up with a person, you don't think of them necessarily as someone you can learn from, but that is so wrong. As Gabby pointed out, actually, in our conversation, the opportunity to learn is something that exists at all levels, at all stages of your career, and from anyone who comes your way. So, hats off to her. Thank you, Gabby, for pointing that out. I certainly learned a lot from my conversation with her, but there are three main takeaways that I think I can focus on. One is that there is an opportunity, a vast opportunity, for India to build legendary brands and companies with global scale. This is something that is on its way to happening, that has been happening, and that, as Gabby points out, will happen in our lifetime. The second thing that I really took away from my conversation with her was this idea of don't gender stereotype leadership, right? Gabby really thought about why it was that I was asking her about being a woman leader rather than a leader in general who might happen to be a woman. That's an interesting one, and definitely a question that I want to ask other people in subsequent interviews. And the third takeaway, I think, from our conversation is this idea that she put out there about creating your own ism. Whatever it is that you sort of that floats your boat, that gets you going in the day, create your own ism. And this is one that I certainly do live by already. I'm guilty of it. I call it unleashing my free spirit, something I think that my mother would perhaps tell me to curb a bit, curb my enthusiasm. But anyway, those are my takeaways, my main takeaways, I should say, from my conversation with Gabby, Gayatri Yadav, the CMO of Sequoia Ventures. So stay tuned for more exciting conversations to come soon. I'm always trying to bring you these wonderful women and the wonderful work they're doing, and I'm finding them right here in my own community.